I used to be an art dealer in Bond Street and gave up in about 95. And I sort of was trying to work out what the next move should be. And I'd always been a huge admirer of the Lord Snowdon book on Private View. And I thought, wouldn't it be a good idea to edit a new edition of it? But, this was the 60s, it's been noticed 30 years later. And it didn't really come to anything, partly because I think, Snowdon's book in the 60s was very much about British art, and it was kind of London and, perhaps Lowry or something like that. But actually by the 90s, the art world had become so international that you couldn't confine it to a book on British art. But I had meetings with Thames and Hudson, and they knew I knew this group. I could tell there was a huge energy in the mid-90s, and it should be recorded, and nobody was recording it. And they said, well, why don't you just go out with a camera and start recording yourself? And I'd never taken photographs before. And I've thought about it long and hard, and I think sometimes one thing I'm very lucky about in my photographic career is getting my timing right, because even though people had mobile phones in the mid-90s, they didn't use them the way that everybody. Now, if you were at a party or something and something extraordinary happened, 30 people would get out their phones and go click, click, click. And I was the only person in the room with a camera. Anyway, going back to it, even though I had absolutely no idea how to take a photograph, I bought myself a point and shoot and went out and just every evening I'd have it in my back pocket and go click, click, click. So that's how it happened, really. And then Thames and Hudson published a book, Spitfire. And because of that, I then was asked to do the Portraits for the Sensation exhibition at the Royal Academy. There was a lot of hedonism, but I also think there's a tradition of photographing the artist in the studio, very classic, standing, sort of lit beautifully. But I think by the 90s, obviously some of the painters worked in the traditional way in the studio, but a lot of other people didn't. And going out at night, they were their fiercest champions, but also their toughest critics. And I think they bounced ideas off. So an all-nighter wasn't just getting drunk and having fun. It was an extension of the studio, I think. Every artist responds to the camera in a very different way. And I think Damien is a natural performer. And so he will always ham it up for the camera. And that's one of the reasons, one of my favorite photographs of him is standing in a field with the cows around him. He was the last person I photographed for Sensation, and he was slightly resistant to being photographed. But he eventually capitulated. And I went to Devon, and he's sweet as always, but slightly uncomfortable. And that's I think it's one of the only photographs of Damien I know which is actually showing any vulnerability. I don't have a kind of hierarchy, because sometimes I think the most incidental picture can be as important or as attractive or as interesting as something more studied. There is one picture I particularly love, which is of Sam Taylor Johnson, who was Sam Taylor Wood in those days. And there's something so simple, and she's not playing any tricks. And there's sort of honesty to it, which I particularly love that picture. Yes, you knew something absolutely extraordinary was happening, but what I didn't see was how the world was going to change after that period. And I think in the 90s, it was a gobby era, whether it's Oasis or Damien or Tracey. And I think nobody was shy of expressing their opinions then. All of them had held very strong opinions and voiced them. And I think people are a bit more timid these days to do so. Remember, it was before social media, where you could just be, diatribe would come if you say the wrong thing, or people think you said the wrong thing. And I think in the 90s, people could say whatever they like, and if people didn't like what they said, they would have to argue fight their ground, which I think is much healthier than having to keep zip. I like the company of artists, partly because it's exhilarating, and partly because they can be very tricky. And I think, going back to that trust thing, I think something that a lot of artists have is profound self-belief and huge vulnerability. And it's a sort of dichotomy which makes them difficult to handle. And I completely understand it. And I think because I understood that dichotomy, they sort of trusted me. We were all sort of on the same wavelength.